Sweetwater, Wyoming Territory, 1881. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs only to men who have built something substantial with their own two hands and then watched it come apart despite every honest effort to hold it together. And Josiah Kellerman carried that grief the way other men carried old injuries, a permanent ache that flared worst on quiet evenings when he had nothing else to occupy his mind. He was 57 years old, and for nearly 30 of those years he had owned and run one of the finest cattle operations in the territory. 8,000 acres his own father had first claimed, built steadily larger through Josiah's own careful management until the Kellerman name meant something considerable throughout 3 counties. Then came 4 consecutive years of drought, harsh enough to break even well-managed operations, followed by a winter so brutal it had taken half his remaining herd outright, and Josiah had watched over that terrible stretch as the banknotes he had taken to survive the drought years came due against an operation that could no longer support them. He had sold the land, piece by piece, until nothing remained, and now, at 57, worked as a hired foreman on a smaller spread owned by a younger man who had bought part of Josiah's own former acreage at the auction, a fact that cost him something every single morning he rode out to work, land his own father had once claimed, passing the old boundary markers he himself had set decades before, now marking somebody else's property entirely. He was tall still, broad through the shoulders despite the years, his hair gone fully gray now, not the salt and pepper of a man merely aging, but a deep, thorough gray that had come on hard and fast during the worst of the drought years, as though the stress itself had simply burned the color out of him. His beard matched, kept short and practical, and his hands carried the permanent marks of 4 decades of hard ranch work, scarred and strong, even now that the land beneath his boots belonged to somebody else. His wife, Ellen, had died 6 years back, before the worst of the drought hit, and Josiah had sometimes found himself grateful in his darker moments that she had not lived to watch everything they had built together come apart so completely. She used to tell him in gentler years that a marriage built on shared work generally outlasted one built on shared comfort, since work taught 2 people how to face genuine hardship together, and Josiah had carried that particular observation with him through every hard season since her death, wondering whether he would ever again find someone willing to face hardship alongside him rather than simply admiring him from the comfort of easier times. Sweetwater sat along a wide bend of the river that gave the territory its name, a modest but growing settlement with a mercantile, a church, a small schoolhouse, and enough scattered ranches to keep the town's economy steady through good years and lean ones alike. The town had watched Josiah's decline with a particular mixture of sympathy and quiet discomfort, the kind small communities generally feel toward a formerly prominent man reduced to hired labor. Several of the old-timers who remembered the Kellerman operation at its height, finding it difficult to meet his eye at the mercantile counter, not out of any judgment, but out of the plain awkwardness of watching a proud man's hardest years play out in public. Josiah himself had settled into the particular quiet of a man who had stopped expecting much from his days, rising early out of old habit rather than any remaining ambition, doing his employer's work competently and without complaint, and retreating each evening to a rented room that held little beyond the bare necessities a working man required. Nell Abernathy was 28 years old and had arrived in Sweetwater that spring from Cheyenne, having trained for 2 years under a respected milliner before saving enough to open a small shop of her own, crafting and trimming hats and bonnets for the ranching wives and daughters scattered throughout the territory who had previously ordered such things from catalogs and waited months for delivery. She had chosen Sweetwater deliberately, having researched the surrounding ranching population carefully enough to know the town could support a proper shop without the fierce competition already established in the larger cities, a practical calculation that spoke plainly to the same careful mind she brought to every piece of business she conducted. She had light red hair, kept pinned in a neat practical style suited to close detailed work, bright and coppery under the shop's window light, and favored a light blue dress protected by a canvas apron that generally carried a scattering of loose thread and pins by the end of any working day. She was strikingly pretty, and the town's bachelors had noticed within her first week. though she managed their attention with the same brisk, unhurried competence she brought to a difficult hat frame, more interested in establishing her business than in encouraging any particular suitor, a priority she stated plainly to anyone forward enough to ask. Her mother, a seamstress herself back in Cheyenne, used to tell Nell that the truest measure of quality work was whether it still held its shape after years of honest wear, that flimsy things fell apart the first hard season, while properly built things simply aged gracefully into something even more valuable than they had been new. Nell had carried that instruction into her own trade, and it had shaped, without her fully realizing it, the particular way she came to see people as well as hats, always looking past the first impression toward whatever sturdier structure lay beneath. It was in early June that Josiah first came into Nell's shop, not for himself, but on an errand for his employer's wife, delivering a bonnet that needed a repaired ribbon, and the two of them fell into an unexpectedly easy conversation. While Nell made the quick repair, Josiah surprising himself with how readily the words came after months of guarded silence around most of Sweetwater. "You have a good eye for structure," he observed, watching her work the ribbon back into place with quick, sure fingers. "Same principle as fence building, I expect. Get the frame right and the rest holds." "Not many men make that comparison," she said, glancing up with open curiosity. "Most think hat making is all fuss and no engineering." "It is mostly engineering," he said, "just prettier than a fence line." She laughed at that, surprised by it, and the errand that should have taken 5 minutes stretched into the better part of 20, both of them lingering over a conversation neither had particularly intended to have. That should have been the whole of it, a pleasant chance conversation between a hired foreman and the town's new milliner, the kind of small, pleasant exchange that fills an otherwise ordinary day and is generally forgotten by evening. Except that Josiah found himself, over the following weeks, inventing small reasons to pass by Nell's shop during his infrequent trips into town, and Nell, for her part, found herself watching for his particular unhurried walk past her window with an attentiveness she did not immediately examine too closely. It was in July that Nell mentioned to a customer, not intending the remark to reach anyone beyond the shop, that her own small storeroom shelving had begun sagging under the weight of her fabric stock, a repair she had neither the tools nor the particular skill to manage herself. Josiah heard of it within the week, the way most things eventually traveled through a town this size, and appeared at her shop door one evening after his own long workday finished, offering, plainly, to fix it himself if she would allow it, an offer she accepted readily, recognizing in it exactly the kind of quiet, competent help she had learned to value in her own trade. He fixed the shelving properly, reinforcing the whole structure rather than merely patching the sag, working past dark by lamplight until the job was done right, and refused any payment beyond the coffee she made him once the work was finished. "You did not have to stay so late over it," she told him, setting the coffee down. "I know," he said. "Seemed a foolish thing to do a job halfway when I had the evening free and the proper tools already in hand." "I know," he said again, some weeks later, when a similar small repair, this time her shop's sticking front door, found itself quietly fixed before she had even properly mentioned the problem to anyone beyond her own private frustration. It was in August that Nell's shipment of imported ribbon, ordered specially from Denver and representing a considerable portion of her limited working capital, arrived damaged from a rough stage journey, several bolts water-stained and unsellable, a loss significant enough that she sat alone in her shop that evening, doing anxious arithmetic she did not share with anyone. Josiah, stopping by the following morning with no particular errand beyond the habit their friendship had become, found her uncharacteristically quiet over her account books, and once she explained the loss, plainly, without asking for anything, he simply sat down beside her and worked through the numbers with her, the same careful, methodical attention he had once brought to his own ranch ledgers, until the two of them had worked out a revised ordering schedule that would absorb the loss without endangering the whole operation. He did not offer money, having none substantial to offer, but he offered his full attention and his considerable experience managing hard financial seasons, patiently walking her through the same painful arithmetic he had once applied to his own failing operation. And Nell found, working through the crisis alongside him, that the attention itself was worth more to her than money would have been, a lesson in what genuinely sustained a person through hardship, that she found herself thinking about often in the weeks that followed. "I did not expect to need a business partner tonight," she told him, once the worst of the anxious calculating was finished. "I know," he said. "Seemed a foolish thing to let you sit here doing that arithmetic alone when I have considerable practice doing exactly that particular arithmetic myself." Nell, in turn, began noticing things about Josiah's own circumstances, the fact that his work shirts, though clean, had grown thin and patched at the elbows in a way that spoke plainly of a man no longer able to easily replace what wore out. And she began, without much comment, mending and reinforcing whatever garments he brought by her shop under the pretense of needing a button resewn, doing considerably more repair work than the stated errand required, and charging him only for the button. "I know you did not have to do all that for the price of one button," he told her, the first time he properly examined the reinforced seams she had quietly added. "I know," she said, echoing his own words back at him with a small, dry smile. Seemed a foolish thing to send a man back out in a shirt that would not survive another hard season. The town noticed, as small towns invariably do. Mrs. Beatrice Whitfield, who ran the mercantile, remarked to her husband that the new milliner seemed to be seeing rather a lot of Josiah Kellerman for a woman who had arrived in Sweetwater barely 2 months prior, and old Clyde Dedrick, who had known Josiah's father, observed at the blacksmith shop that Josiah had taken to visiting town considerably more often than his employment strictly required. Josiah told himself he was simply grateful for decent company in a town that had grown increasingly awkward around him since his own decline, the plain human comfort of being seen as a whole person rather than merely a cautionary tale about drought and bad debt. Nell told herself she was simply extending the same practical kindness to Josiah that she extended to any struggling client, nothing more complicated than good business practice paired with basic human decency. Neither explanation held up especially well under close examination, but neither of them examined it too closely, because the examining threatened to surface something both had reasons to leave carefully alone. Josiah's fear, when he finally sat with it honestly one evening in the small rented room that was now the whole of his domestic life, wore the exact shape his losses had built for it. He was 57 years old, 29 years Nell's senior, a man who had once owned 8,000 acres and now owned nothing beyond his own 2 hands and whatever wages his employer paid him. And he told himself, with the same brutal honesty he had learned to apply to his own ruined finances, that he had nothing whatsoever left to properly offer a young woman building a fresh, promising business of her own. He filed the growing warmth between them into the safest available category, a pleasant friendship between 2 people who understood hard, careful work, and told himself firmly that the category would hold, even as it grew steadily less convincing. With every evening, he found some fresh excuse to be near her shop. Nell's fear wore a quieter, more practical shape. She had built her entire business on projecting steady competence and reliability to a territory of ranching families who needed to trust that their orders would be handled properly. And she wondered, privately, whether attaching herself to a man whose own recent history involved such visible public financial ruin might undermine the careful professional reputation she was still actively building. She told herself, therefore, that what she felt toward Josiah was simple appreciation for a decent, hard-working man, nothing more, and kept her manner brisk and businesslike even as the feeling grew, week over week, into something considerably harder to keep so simply categorized. It was around this time that word reached Nell, through the usual channels, that Thaddeus Kroll, a prosperous young rancher new to the county with considerable inherited wealth, had begun making inquiries about her, mentioning to Mrs. Whitfield that he intended to call on the talented young milliner formally, an interest the town watched with immediate approval, since by every sensible measure, a wealthy young rancher represented precisely the match a struggling businesswoman ought to welcome. Mrs. Whitfield, delighted by the prospect, mentioned to anyone who would listen at the mercantile counter that Kroll had inherited nearly 6,000 acres from an uncle back east, and stood, by every reasonable measure, to become one of the wealthiest ranchers in the whole territory within a decade. I want to pause the story here for just a moment, because this is exactly the point where a man who has already decided he has nothing left worth offering has to watch a wealthier, more suitable rival step forward with everything Josiah himself no longer possessed. Josiah had spent weeks insisting to himself that his feelings for Nell belonged strictly to friendship. He was about to discover exactly how much that insistence cost him, watching it nearly hand the whole field to a man whose only real advantage was money Josiah himself had once possessed and lost. If you have been enjoying this story tonight, I would love to know whereabouts in the world you are joining us from. Whether that is somewhere across the United States, up in Canada, over in the United Kingdom or Australia, or anywhere else this old story happens to have traveled tonight. Do drop your country down in the comments below. It genuinely means a great deal to us to see how far these tales reach. Now, let us get back to Sweetwater, because Josiah Kellerman is about to say the truest, most painful thing he has said aloud in years, and discover whether it costs him everything or finally offers him something worth keeping. Josiah heard of Thaddeus Kroll's intentions from his own employer, mentioned in passing over evening chores, and spent the following days turning the news over with a discomfort he had not expected from himself, a grown man well past the age for such foolishness, arriving finally at a conclusion he found entirely unwilling to accept, that watching Nell Abernathy accept a wealthier, more suitable match represented a loss he had no adequate language left to properly express. He rode into town that Saturday evening, finding her alone in her shop after closing, sweeping the day's accumulated thread and scraps from the floor, the lamp already lit against the coming dusk, the whole small shop wrapped in the particular quiet of a working day finally finished. "I heard Thaddeus Kroll means to call on you formally," he said, foregoing any pretense of an errand. "Word travels fast in a town this size," she said, setting down the broom. "I have spent 2 months telling myself I was simply grateful for your company," he said. "And in 2 months, nothing has once made me want to argue with that story, until I heard Kroll's name mentioned and felt something considerably less friendly than gratitude." "Josiah," she said, careful, her voice dropping quieter than her usual brisk manner, "why have you never once said anything plainly in 2 whole months?" He was quiet a long moment, the shop settling around them in the evening light. "Because I have nothing left to offer you," he finally said, plain in a way that cost him visibly to say. "I am 57 years old, Nell. I lost 8,000 acres my own father built. I lost the herd. I lost the name that used to mean something in 3 counties. Gray hair's all I have left to offer a woman building the kind of future you are building. I did not think it decent to ask you to want a man with nothing left in his hands but that." The shop held very still, dust motes hanging suspended in the lamplight, the evening settling fully outside the window. Nell set down the dustpan she had been holding, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something close to a whisper, the particular quiet reserved for words too important for anything louder. "Then I will take every last one," she whispered. "Every gray hair, Josiah. I have spent 2 months watching a man who lost everything material still show up, evening after evening, with nothing but decent, careful attention and quietly competent hands, fixing my shelving and reinforcing my seams and asking for nothing in return beyond coffee and honest conversation. You keep speaking as though gray hair and empty hands are the whole of what you are offering. They are not. What you are actually offering is exactly the kind of steady, honest character that outlasts a hard season, the same thing my own mother taught me to look for in good, sturdy work. I did not build a business trusting flimsy things. I am not about to start trusting one now." "Is that an answer?" he asked, needing the plain word. "It is considerably more than an answer," she said, the smallest true smile finding her mouth despite the weight of the moment. "It is a whole life I am asking to help you rebuild, Josiah, if you are brave enough to let somebody help you rebuild it." Josiah Kellerman, 57 years old and certain that very evening that he had nothing left in the world worth offering anybody, crossed the small distance of her shop and kissed her, careful at first, the way a man approaches anything he has convinced himself he no longer deserves, and then considerably less careful, while somewhere outside, the last of that evening's light finally gave way to full dark. Word moved through Sweetwater with predictable speed once their courtship became evident. Mrs. Whitfield declared she had suspected it since the shelving repair. Thaddeus Kroll, informed of Nell's decision, took took the disappointment with reasonable grace, remarking to Mrs. Whitfield that he had sensed these past weeks that her attention had settled somewhere his own considerable prospects could not properly compete with. And old Clyde Dedrick claimed with evident satisfaction that he had known it the moment Josiah started visiting town 3 times a week instead of 1. They married that autumn in a small ceremony at the Sweetwater Church, with a fair portion of the county in attendance, curiosity and genuine goodwill, both drawing a crowd considerably larger than either of them had expected. Nell wore light blue rather than any traditional bridal white, having long ago decided that a woman ought to be married in whatever genuinely suited her rather than whatever convention demanded, and she looked, standing at the front of that small church, exactly as striking as Josiah had quietly believed since that first June afternoon over a repaired ribbon. His hands, scarred and steady from 4 decades of hard work, trembled slightly saying his vows, a fact Nell would tease him about gently for years afterward. And when it came his turn to speak beyond the standard words, he told her plainly that he had spent 2 months believing he had nothing left worth offering anybody, and that she had proven, one quietly reinforced seam at a time, that a man could be entirely wrong about his own accounting of his own worth. Mrs. Whitfield, watching from the second pew, was overheard remarking afterward that she had never once witnessed a courtship conducted so thoroughly through storeroom shelving and account ledgers, and doubted she ever would again, a sentiment echoed by several other witnesses as the whole small church settled into the particular warm commotion that follows any wedding a community has watched unfold slowly, one quiet kindness and one careful repair at a time. Their first year together settled into a rhythm neither of them had fully expected, Nell's millinery business growing steadily as her reputation for quality work spread through the territory, families now traveling considerable distances for a properly fitted hat, Josiah taking on additional carpentry and repair work throughout town, once word spread of his considerable practical skill, work that came to him steadily enough that he rarely wanted for it. The 2 trades combining into a modest but genuinely stable shared income that neither had managed quite so comfortably alone, their combined account books, kept jointly now in Josiah's careful hand with Nell's business instincts guiding every major decision, showing steadier growth than either operation had managed independently. He built her a proper new storefront display that first winter, sized and lit exactly to showcase her finished work, because he had noticed, without her mentioning it twice, precisely what her growing business needed. Old Clyde Dedrick took to remarking at the blacksmith shop that the combined Kellerman operation had turned out considerably steadier than either half had managed alone, a compliment that reached Josiah second-hand and settled something in him that months of his own private reassurance had failed to properly quiet, the particular relief of hearing from an outside voice that the man he had become was not merely surviving but genuinely thriving. It was not without its harder moments. That following spring, Josiah's old employer offered him the chance to buy back a modest 20 acres of his former land at auction price, a genuine but financially precarious opportunity that would have required nearly everything they had saved. And Nell found herself torn between wanting to give him back some piece of what he had lost and fearing the risk might undo the careful stability they had only just built together. She lay awake several nights that week turning the decision over without raising it directly, watching Josiah study the old survey maps of his former acreage with an expression she recognized as genuine longing. Josiah, sensing her hesitation, did not push the matter. He told her plainly that he had already lost 8,000 acres once and survived it, and that he would rather keep what they had built slowly and honestly than risk it chasing back a piece of his old pride. And Nell, hearing him choose their shared stability over his own former standing, found her own worry easing into genuine relief that he had made the choice so plainly his own. He folded the old survey maps away that same week and did not bring them out again, though Nell noticed some months later that he had kept them regardless, tucked carefully into a drawer rather than discarded entirely, a small private acknowledgement that some losses, even willingly set aside, were not the same thing as losses fully forgotten. 3 years passed, and on a bright June afternoon, almost exactly to the day since Josiah had first walked into her shop with a torn ribbon, Nell stood in the doorway of their combined shop, watching Josiah work on a customer's fence repair in the yard behind it, Their daughter, Ellen Grace, coppery-haired like her mother, perched on her hip and reaching toward her father with delighted, fearless hands. The shop window behind her displayed 3 new hats finished that week, and beside them, a small hand-lettered sign advertising Josiah's carpentry services, the 2 trades sharing equal space in a window neither of them had needed to argue over how to divide, a small daily proof of exactly how thoroughly their 2 lives had woven themselves into one shared enterprise. "That fence will hold considerably longer than the one it replaced," Josiah said, finishing his work and coming toward them, wiping his hands clean on his work trousers. "It ought to," she said, smiling. "You always did have a good eye for structure." He looked at her a long moment, their daughter babbling contentedly against her shoulder, the June light settling warm across the whole small yard. "You know," he said, "I still think about telling you gray hair was all I had left to offer. And I still think about telling you I would take every last one," she said. "Best trade I ever made, offering you what little I had left," he said, and meant it entirely. In every sense a man rebuilding a whole life could mean such a thing. I want to stop here for just a moment before we close this story out, because I believe there is something in it worth sitting with tonight. We often measure a person's worth by what they currently possess, by the visible markers of success or failure that a community can plainly see and judge. Josiah Kellerman had lost every visible marker of the prosperous, respected man he once was, and he mistook that visible loss for the whole truth of what remained inside him. There is a particular cruelty in the way loss teaches a person to discount themselves, as though a man's worth were simply a tally of acreage and cattle rather than something considerably harder to auction off. Josiah had spent months believing his own gray hair and empty hands told the whole truth about what he had to offer, and it took a young woman trained to see structure beneath surface to show him the accounting was badly incomplete. But Nell Abernathy, trained by her own mother to look past first impressions toward whatever sturdier structure lay beneath, saw something Josiah himself had stopped believing was there: steady character, honest hands, and the particular quiet reliability that survives hard seasons precisely because it was never built on wealth to begin with. Gray hair, in the end, was never really the whole of what Josiah had left to offer. It was simply the most visible evidence of everything he had already survived, and survival itself, faced honestly and without bitterness, turns out to be worth considerably more than the acreage or the herd or the name he had lost. Sometimes what feels like nothing left is actually everything that matters most, simply waiting for somebody patient enough to recognize its true, lasting value. Thank you so much for spending this hour with Josiah and Nell tonight, wherever in this wide world you happen to be listening from. I would love to know down in the comments, were you rooting for Josiah from that very first repaired ribbon? Or did it take you a little longer, the way it took Nell herself, to trust that what remained of him was worth considerably more than what he had lost? If this story kept you good company this evening, a like on this video and a subscribe to the channel mean a great deal to us and cost you nothing at all. And if you know someone who might need a quiet, gentle hour like this one, please do consider passing it along to them. Wherever you are tonight, I hope somebody sees past whatever you believe you have lost, straight through to everything valuable that remains. Until next time, keep riding.